In a mere week, Israel is back fighting in Gaza, Ben Gvir is back in the government, and Netanyahu moves to fire the head of Shin Bet. U.S. attacks the Houthis attack Israel, and rockets from Gaza in the direction of central Israel on Thursday afternoon. As we said, a mere week. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. Unholy, two Jews on the news. We have been bringing you updates throughout the week, but as you say, Yonit, the news is continually coming. And there is this sense, I know that the Prime Minister talks about the war on 7 fronts, 8 fronts, but that's, not even to include the politics here, which is just proceeding in multiple directions at once. It reminds me a little bit of what's going on in the US, where it's very, very hard to keep track because there are so many moving parts. Anyway, we'll do our bit, and especially with our guest, to clarify some of this and to enable people to see through this thicket and see what's happening.
I made this dark joke with you this week. We recorded an update on Monday because of the decision to oust Ron and Bar, and an update on Tuesday because Israel returned to the war in Gaza. And I wrote to you on Tuesday evening, we still have time to record another update episode before our actual episode on Thursday. And of course, the news keeps coming, right? All Israelis it's a nation exhausted today as we speak on Thursday afternoon because the war in Gaza resumed, so the Houthis are back firing ballistic missiles towards Israel, and one of them was fired in the direction of central Israel around 4 a.m., I believe. And it's difficult, I think, to explain what that means when you are awakened suddenly by this siren in the middle of the night, really the dead of night. Everyone's deeply asleep, and the first thing you do is run to your children's bedroom to, take them to the safe room. And just in this instance, I, ran to my daughter's bedroom and realized they weren't in their beds. And that moment of small heart attack that you have when that is what you are confronted with, and the sirens are, rating, and then you realize that what happened was that although they're rather small, 7 and 9, they have already walked into the safe room independently. And so there's a moment where you say, oh, wow, that's they're grown up and they do this by themselves. And then you're like, that is actually kind of sad that this is the childhood they are used to. They're so used to that realm of sirens in the middle of the night. They just knew what to do. They didn't need the parental guidance in that regard. So that was my night, Jonathan. I hope you slept better.
Actually, I didn't, but for not for those reasons. But I think that's you've said it. It is on the one hand, a sign of resilience, but poignant actually, and sad that it's being drilled into kids to they know the drill even at that young age, and even in that sleepless, bleary-eyed stage of the night. We will get on to all of it. I'm feeling very dispirited by this return to violence. Well, our guest, Amos Harel from Haaretz, your people will hear when we ask him what's this about. He says, and he's been writing all week, and others have too, that this is about politics and about, Netanyahu shoring up his coalition. It just seems to me, I think journalists don't like using the language of morality because it sounds somehow earnest or pious. It seems to me a terribly immoral thing that there are, on one level, the experience you've described, there are the hostage families who feel their relatives have been abandoned. There are, it seems, and of course there are caveats to be issued about the numbers, but hundreds of Palestinians dead now, in order to serve a political calculation of the Prime Minister. He needs more numbers in his coalition because a big budget vote's coming, and therefore suddenly hundreds of people are dead. And I think that kind of moral calculus is really unconscionable. And yet it's, analysts and others rightly factor it in and say that's what's going on. I think, I'm pausing myself for a moment to think if that is really what is driving this, and we know there are other justifications advanced. But if seasoned analysts are saying this is about a prime minister who's just doing the numbers in the parliament and keeping his majority, and hundreds of people are dead as a result, I think it's pretty unconscionable.
Yeah, I don't know if I would put it exactly in the same words, but I think that it is...
Really, you surprised me. I thought you'd say it exactly the same word.
I would phrase it differently, only in the sense that it is very clear, and any expert, I think, would say that the road to weakening Hamas in the deep sense of it, and having an alternative in Gaza and having a day after in Gaza, means that there will be a continuation of this war in all kinds of ways and incursions and things like that over years. The problem to resume, I think the problematic point in resuming the war at this point, whether it is for a few days, weeks or more, is that there are, more than 20 hostages, Israeli hostages, alive now. And you know exactly in what situation they are in because hostages came back recently and told you. And I think that doing this now has that, problem of saying this is the most urgent thing. This is what we need to deal with. By the way, if you are one of those people, and there are many in Israel, who think that this is a political calculation, the prime minister needs his formidable coalition behind him to pass the budget, at least that gives you some sort of, maybe again, if you're the one phrasing it like that, it gives you some hope to say, wait, after the budget passes, maybe then you have, and that has to happen in the next sort of week or so, then maybe you have a road back into the negotiations, the hostage negotiations. In the meantime, the protest movement against all of this is sort of, it's gaining momentum on the one hand, but on the other hand, it kind of has a few hills to die on, right? Because on the one hand, the protest movement is protesting the government, it's protesting the return to war, it's protesting what they think is the abandonment of the hostages. On the other hand, it's not the other hand, but in addition to that, you have the firing of Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet. We had a special update on that, and the intent to fire the attorney general. All that is part of the protest. So it's kind of someone who wants to protest all this finds himself, or herself asking, wait, do I protest bringing back the hostages? Do I support that in Tel Aviv? Do I today protest against the firing of Ronen Bar in Jerusalem? It's all a little bit dispersed or diffused, and you kind of, the people who want to oppose this don't really, I think, are not exactly coalesced around in these targets in very large numbers yet.
Yes, I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but the sheer number of grievances there are against the Prime Minister oddly helps the Prime Minister because it makes this movement against him, as you say, diffuse. And it means that instead of there being, all the more and more reasons for people to come out on the street, in some ways it dilutes it. And, when you and I talked all through those months in 2023 before October 7, the sheer focus there was on the judicial coup gave a clarity, singularity to the movement. And it meant, even if people disagreed on other things, they all agreed on that. Mm-hmm. There is an absence of that clarity now. Just on the moral point, I would say absolutely the abandonment of the hostages is right there in the mix. Obviously, the loss of Palestinian life in terms of the case I was making is right up there. I would add a third thing, which is the dishonesty of the argument made, the Prime Minister saying yet again, this is about total victory, our two goals, total victory over Hamas and the return of hostages. That is such a dishonest case to make for two reasons. One, those two goals are at odds. This is what the hostage families are telling us loud and clear. You cannot simultaneously say your number one priority is bringing them back while you are bombing potentially them because you don't know where they are. We'll talk about this later. But also this notion of total victory, it is a mirage. It is an illusion, and the Prime Minister is engaged in dishonesty saying it because we've just seen, a matter of time goes by and there's Hamas launching its rockets again. This is an enemy that will never be entirely defeated. It won't even be, I don't think, entirely disarmed. I know people say, okay, but you'll never defeat the idea, but you'll still be able to defeat them militarily. I don't believe that is realistic. And a lot of the different military people we've spoken to on the podcast over the months share that view. Eventually, you're going to have to come up with some kind of political arrangement for this. And the thing that is dishonest here is Netanyahu keeps saying total victory because it's always tomorrow is always a day away. It's always just out of reach. If you want the country to be on a permanent war footing so that you are forever the war prime minister who can never be removed, you say the goal is total victory because it will always be out of reach. I think that is fundamentally dishonest.
I mean, if we take Netanyahu out of the equation for a second and we look at what happened to Israel after the Second Intifada, right? How did Israel defeat the infrastructure of terror in the West Bank? And the answer is twofold. One, it took years. And a military presence in the West Bank, of course, and the assistance of the Palestinian Authority. All that could work in Gaza if you have the assistance of the Palestinian Authority in one way or another. You call it whatever you want.
But Netanyahu won't even countenance discussion of that.
Yes, and if you are prepared for this kind of prolonged sort of presence in a way, and a war that will continue for years, and you prepare the world for this military operation that might last years. So this is all, and I think you can, and military analysts will tell you, you can weaken Hamas in that sort of way. What you're right about is to say to the Israeli people that we can have total victory in weeks or just a little bit more is disingenuous, probably one might say disingenuous at best. But I do want to zoom out a little bit, and we're talking a lot about the war in Gaza, and we will talk about that with Amos Harel, but I want to talk about, and this is of course connected, what is happening in Israel internally. And to maybe sort of set the stage for that conversation, I would want to read to you, pretty shocking, one should say, what the official Prime Minister's Twitter account, X account, posted yesterday. By the way, since then, it has been deleted. But this is what was written, and I think it has to, it kind of sets the stage on what we are talking about. And I'm quoting verbatim. It says, "In America and in Israel, when a strong right-wing leader wins an election, the leftist deep state weaponizes the justice system to thwart the people's will. They won't win in either place. We stand strong together." The official account of the Prime Minister of Israel, which usually, hosts these very innocuous posts about "I just met the leader of," etc. So this is what came out, and of course it is the backdrop, or maybe the backdrop, or maybe the foreground of what is happening in Israel. We are on, Jonathan, I don't think we can mince words here, on a collision course between the government and the prime minister and the judiciary. It is very clear that we are heading, there are 3 trains that are on their way. They're all going to hit a wall when they reach the High Court of Justice. And I'm referring, of course, to 3 decisions made by this government. One is to oust the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. We talked about this at length. This is just not a decision to move someone from their post. The Shin Bet is an internal security service. It is something that deals with not only the internal issues of terror, or preventing terror, or preventing espionage, but also upholding Israeli democracy. Here, that is the jurisdiction of the Shin Bet. So when you move someone like the head of Shin Bet at this moment, it has its consequences. Of course, it does when the Shin Bet is investigating the prime minister's own office for a story called Qatargate. We will also relate to that in our conversation with Amos Harel. I seem to be going very fast. Do you want me to slow down? Because I have more to say.
No, I was just going to come in on this tweet or this post on X. As I understand it, deleted from the official Prime Minister's account, then reposted from the personal account of Benjamin Netanyahu. In Hebrew, initially it was posted in English, making this direct connection with Donald Trump. It is as clear an example or an evidence as you could wish for of the fact that Netanyahu feels emboldened by what Donald Trump is doing. He thinks it gives him cover. He is engaged in a power grab. I think it's an authoritarian power grab aimed at removing any checks or restraints on his power. And he sees in Washington a leader doing exactly the same thing. They are both in the business of sweeping away the guardrails that are essential to the functioning of a democracy. And the number one guardrail really is the law, the rule of law. And Donald Trump is on a collision course, more than, where his vice president says we don't have to obey the rulings of the Supreme Court, said that nearly a year ago. They've ignored these judgments from judges as they're deporting migrants and saying, oops, when the plane lands with migrants, even though the judge had ordered the plane to be turned around, and then attacking as radical leftists judges who give rulings against them. Netanyahu's watching all that and thinking, that's what I'm going to do right here. Actually, of course, he was already doing it, hence judicial coup, etc., in 2023 and before. But now he's got the cover of the most powerful man in the world, and he thinks he wants to, follow in his slipstream. And by doing it in English, he's making that crystal clear. I am in the same game. It should be chilling what's happening in the United States, the erosion of those democratic safeguards. It is just as chilling in Israel. And this notion of branding judges who are so, in this case, the one Trump went after was appointed, I think, by a Republican, as leftists and radicals and Marxists. It's the same playbook. The poison is the same. They are just enforcing the rule of law. And the message from Netanyahu here is, I should not be bound by the rule of law. I'm Netanyahu, this sort of mythic figure. He sees himself as a Jewish leader of the millennia. I should not be restrained by the rule of law. Anyone who tries to do that is some dangerous Marxist leftist. It is so insidious, but he has now made it very clear and very plain.
And just think about the fact that in less than 4 years, there might be another party in the White House. And is that a wise thing to do in general when you write it this way in English? But going back to Netanyahu's plans and how this will, might crash, and is really the sort of reopening the rift in the Israeli society. So you have the story of Ronen Bar. And again, it is the High Court of Justice that will decide if this is legal. The government will vote on it as we speak on Thursday, but that still doesn't mean it will happen. The other decision made by the government is to oust the Attorney General herself, Gali Baharav Miara. I'll remind our listeners, in this country, the Attorney General is both head of prosecution and a legal advisor to the government. She has been a thorn in their side from day one. To try and oust her is immensely more complicated than trying to fire Ronen Bar, because Ronen Bar answers directly to the Prime Minister, whereas the Attorney General is independent. You have to set up a committee. You have to appoint some of the people on the committee. The committee will then bring forth its recommendations. It's a long process. And that, too, might arrive on the desk of the High Court of Justice. And the third thing I will remind you, bringing back Itamar Ben-Gvir to be the Minister of National Security is also something that the Attorney General herself said that the government cannot do, because originally Itamar Ben-Gvir, because of his criminal record, because of his different comments that were deemed racist by the Supreme Court, made a pledge, and he said that he would not interfere in the work of the police. This has been proven to be wrong. He did interfere, and there's evidence to the contrary. There have been petitions to the Supreme Court saying this man cannot be the minister that he is. Bringing him back is also going to arrive at the decision of the High Court. Any case here in which the court will decide that the government made a decision that is illegal, then what happens? What if the court says you cannot fire Ronen Bar? Netanyahu says, yes, I can, and appoints someone else. Then what happens? This is a constitutional crisis that Israel has never faced. And in one of these cases, perhaps in all of them, that is where we are heading.
Yeah, and I think it is being played out in parallel. These are two movies sort of unspooling in Washington and in Jerusalem, and they are telling the same story of waiting, almost, triggering, bringing on this confrontation. And I think it is a sobering moment. Just on the point about Ben-Gvir, I see that one of the hostage families said his priority, Prime Minister, was to bring back Ben-Gvir rather than bringing back the hostages. It was one or the other. So in a similar vein, the discussion of the cabinet that was going to be about the hostages has been postponed so that they could instead, on Thursday, as we record, discuss firing Ronen Bar rather than bringing the hostages home. This, to me, looks like a prime minister who's emboldened, who does not care what it looks like. He knows it will look as if it's more important for him to expand his own power than to bring back those hostages who are in a desperate state to come back. And he doesn't mind who knows it. We should turn to our guest, who is a sage on these issues, and no one really reports on them more closely, understands them better than our guest.
Amos Harel is the military and defense analyst for Haaretz newspaper. He's the author of 3 best-selling books, and he is the one person we always turn to when we need to understand what is going on. And there's a lot to understand. Amos, thank you so much for talking to us this week.
Hi, Yonit and Jonathan.
Let's begin with Israel's decision to return to the war in Gaza. Is there a cohesive, coherent plan? What is the strategy, or is it just tactics?
I think more than anything else, it's a political plan. It has to do with Benjamin Netanyahu's survival plans and the understanding that if he doesn't come up with a solution soon regarding the approval of the budget in the Knesset next week, then he may be facing a political challenge, a serious one. His government may collapse. Once he decided to bomb Gaza again and, in fact, to resume the war, the immediate political implication of that was Itamar Ben-Gvir and his party joining in the coalition after leaving 2 months ago because they were against the hostage deal. So I think that's the main context. There are also strategic contexts because, as we know, the negotiations over the next phase of the hostage deal were stuck for quite some time. And yet once Israel decided to strike again, I'm not so sure that this would necessarily lead to any kind of flexibility on Hamas's part. Netanyahu, of course, since this kind of criticism was heard in Israeli media and among some politicians from the opposition, his explanation was that, in fact, all of the security apparatus had supported his actions. But this is part of the truth and not the whole truth. In reality, what has happened is that we haven't seen any kind of progress in the hostage negotiations for more than a month. And if you look at the security chief's so-called organizational DNA, then these are men of action. They're not used to waiting while the ceasefire continues and while Hamas is rebuilding its military force. So under these circumstances, if there's no way forward regarding negotiations, people like Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet, who in fact is about to be fired by Netanyahu, and also the new chief of staff of the army, under these circumstances supported going back into fighting. But it's not as if this was the only option on the table. The main reason for that is Netanyahu's decision not to move forward with the deal. And actually, in fact, Israel is in breach of the deal. Not that, again, Hamas should be blamed for the whole thing. The war, the atrocities on October 7th, the decision to strike Israel. But at this point, I have to admit that it was Israel and not Hamas that was in breach of the agreement under the circumstances.
Which does actually raise an interesting question, which is when there was that big pressure from hostage families, among others, on Netanyahu to do a deal, any deal, that would bring the hostages home, because afterwards you can always go back on it and you can break it. They were told, no, once you've done a deal, it's written in stone, it's unbreakable. And here we've now seen the proof that actually you can do a deal in January and by March you can be back fighting again. That whole business of, can we go back into fighting? Netanyahu's given his answer, hasn't he?
Yeah, sure. And I'm also, he's shown us his priorities. Political survival is above everything else. And in spite of the fact that more than 20 live hostages out of 59 remain in Gaza, the most immediate and urgent thing for him to do is secure his coalition for the next year. Hostages may die as a result, but Netanyahu would go on gaslighting the Israeli public regarding that without admitting that these are the consequences.
We're talking about it like it's a normal thing. It's a tragic thing. And I wonder two things. First of all, Keith Siegel, who was just released, said he was moved 33 times. As you know, much military intelligence that there is about what is happening to the hostages in Gaza, you still can't protect them when there are these kinds of military operations. So how precarious is their situation now? Obviously, the families are quite worried. And what are the chances that a Trump administration in a week or in a couple of days says to Netanyahu, okay, we get it, now let's resume the negotiations and stop the war?
So Segal's statement is extremely interesting because this is not the only case. And I think for a long time, the Israeli intelligence believed that it had a good grasp of what was going on in Gaza, even inside the tunnels, and that it could avoid killing hostages by mistakes. There were places where the IDF did not strike because they feared for hostages' lives. And yet we saw our colleagues at the New York Times, their investigation showed that 41 Israeli hostages were taken alive to the Gaza Strip on October 7th and died since then in captivity. Some of them died because of terrible conditions. Some of them were murdered in cold blood by Hamas. But others were killed unintentionally by the Israeli Air Force or by Israeli artillery. This is the reality. And what we now know from those reports of people like Segal coming back is that it's impossible to keep trace of all of them and, remain cautious and avoid hitting any of those hostages by mistake. This is why, as Jonathan has mentioned, this is why the families of the hostages are in panic, because they know what the result could be. And we've heard some of the hostages talking about near misses, about being in a certain home and the building next to them being destroyed by Israeli Air Force bombs. This is quite an experience. Now, regarding your second question, I think, again, Trump being Trump, it would be useless to try and outguess or understand in advance where he's heading. And yet my sense would be that he's waiting to see how this evolves, that he would give Netanyahu some time and then make the decision. And make no mistake, the decision will be made in Washington and not in Jerusalem. In the end, with no green light from Washington, Netanyahu would find it hard to reoccupy the Gaza Strip in spite of the fact that the IDF is preparing for such a scenario. But also consider this. 3 days ago, Israel announced that it was back into fighting. We haven't seen divisions called in. We haven't seen reservists being immediately deployed on the Gaza border. This means that there's still some time. We may be heading that way, but I wouldn't judge too quickly regarding that. The fact that you see Israeli tanks at the beginning, at the eastern side of the Netzarim corridor, still doesn't mean that Israel is reoccupying the Strip. I think the decision has not been taken yet, and it depends on Trump. And the question, as usual, is what are Trump's priorities? Is he still about reaching that final hostage deal, moving towards the Saudi deal, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize sometime in December? Or are there other issues on the table? Maybe perhaps he's more occupied with Russia and Ukraine and so on. A few days back, his envoy Witikoff was busy trying to secure a small deal, which would mean either one hostage, Idan Alexander with the dual citizenship, and 4 bodies of American hostages returned, or perhaps a larger number, a higher number, maybe 5 hostages. This didn't materialize. But Israel was not too crazy about the idea because to begin with, the fear was that Trump would secure that and then lose interest, say that this was the perfect deal and that he's leaving it to Israel to deal with the rest. This didn't materialize, again, I think because both sides were suspicious about the outcome. Mm-hmm. But what we now have is a resumption of the war, and that's always a dangerous gamble because you know where you start. You never know where this ends.
The way this is looking outside Israel, but also outside the United States, outside the Trump administration, European governments and others, even if they have understood the logic, maybe even just the political arithmetic of the coalition, or of restarting, the scale of it. The first day, I think by some measure, if you accept the figures, we know the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza, 400 dead. Overall, I think by my count, as we speak now, it's about 500 dead.
Perhaps more.
Yes. And on the first day, I think that makes it the deadliest day of the war in its entirety so far. What others point to the fact that because Israel has cut off in this recent period the supply of aid, which includes medical supplies, the hospitals in Gaza are under particular strain. All of that is heightening the impact, in terms of casualties and suffering on Gaza. Does any of that factor in to the decision making, or relating to what you've just been talking about? Does Netanyahu think Washington have got our back? The rest of the world, their view of this doesn't matter. And what do you make of that claim that that it is falling on this attack is landing on Gaza harder because of the decisions taken on aid? Is that right from what you hear from on the ground?
So, Jonathan, I'd take most reports from Gaza with a grain of salt and remind our listeners that it's the Hamas Health Ministry that's publishing reports about casualties, number of children among the dead, aid, and so on. There are bodies of kids there, and there are reports that claims that close to 100 children died during this attack. And we know that Israel targeted all kinds of senior officials in the Hamas government, and that Israel, after October 7th, does not make the distinction between what Hamas claims is its political branch and the military branch, because we know that the political branch is deeply involved in decision-making regarding terrorist activities. I'm not so sure about aid. I think, as far as I can tell from the Israeli side, Hamas, in spite of the fact that Israel has stopped humanitarian convoys from reaching Gaza, Hamas has quite a lot of supplies left, and it's using it first and foremost for its own needs. And yet the sheer numbers, as you said, are very, very high. My sense, first of all, Hamas was taken by complete surprise, and I assume that many of those officials felt they were secure, that they were not identified with people like Mohammed Sinwar or Izzedin al-Haddad, the heads of the military branch, and therefore they could move freely during a ceasefire. So this is perhaps one explanation. The second is, as you've hinted or alluded to, the difference between Trump and Biden. Remember last year, remember May 24 in Rafah, all those heated debates between Biden and Netanyahu, whether Israel should enter Rafah, what the damage would be, and so on. I don't think the Trump administration cares about that. For the time being, Israel has got Trump's back. It could change because of his priorities or his agenda changing. And I think that Netanyahu, you can see the difference in Netanyahu's behavior, also on the domestic front. His decision to fire Ronen Bar, his attempt to fire the Attorney General, his constant speeches about loyalty, his recent videos about the deep state and the tweets about the same deep state threatening both Israel and Washington. He's taking a page out of Trump's book. And that affects everything that's happening in Israel right now.
You made a point to say, this is not yet a reoccupying because there are not large forces, but because of the sort of internal debate in Israel and perhaps because of this draft bill that's on the table and will officially exempt ultra-Orthodox from military service. If there is a call, for reservists to show up, if there is an extended and prolonged campaign now in Gaza, is there a danger that some would not show up?
I think so. And I think the discussion that may surprise Jonathan, but would not be about dead Palestinian kids. It would be about the fate of the hostages and where the country is going as a whole regarding.
By the way, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, regarding the fate of Israeli democracy, Ronen Bar's future. And so on. What we've seen are first signs of this, just one Air Force navigator, one intelligence officer, reservists who've already announced that they're not showing up this time. They haven't been called yet, but they're not going to enlist because they have doubts about the government's plans. So as you said, if you combine the debate over Haredi draft and the fact that the government is doing absolutely nothing to change the reality. If you combine this with the enormous burden on reservists, people who served 300 and 400 days since the beginning of the war, then I think there are trends there that might affect the way people react, and that's I think that the government is absolutely ignoring this issue. I can give you, an example from my past. I just saw a report in the Yonit and Jonathan about my old battalion that I used to serve in an infantry battalion until the time I was 40. Now, at the height of the Second Intifada, we served 40 days a year. And it sounded like a lot to us. This was a huge burden for our families, for our wives and children, and so on. Now, these guys were, of course, younger than me. I still know some of them. They were just released from Miluim, from reserve duty, after serving more than 400 days. Wow. So, okay, some of them ideologically would identify with the government, of course, and say, okay, everything that needs to be done and is necessary will join in. But others, those who support the hostage deal, those who think that bringing the hostages back home is the main goal of the operation, those who have their doubts about Netanyahu's plans for Israeli democracy, all of these people are going to ask questions. Now, you don't have to be an objector by announcing that you're not coming. You can call your commander, who you've known for 15 or 20 years, and find a way out using an excuse. Your kid is just ill, you're starting a new job, whatever. We've seen that already, not for political reasons, just because people are tired. It's a long war of attrition. But I think these trends might get stronger because of the general feeling. I haven't seen any polls yet, but I assume that the current decision is less popular than in the past. And we've seen through these 17 months of the war that, by and large, the Israeli public was in support of the war. It had its doubts, a lot of criticism regarding Herzi Halevi and, of course, Netanyahu himself. And yet there was a consensus that this needed to be done. I suspect that this is no longer the case, considering the circumstances of the decision to resume the war.
So let's talk about the decision to fire Ronen Bar while all of this is going on. How significant is this decision, and particularly not only the firing of the head of Shin Bet, but also the fact that Netanyahu will be the one to appoint his replacement? Again, if this, passes the legal threshold, how significant is this?
To foreign listeners, this may sound quite strange. The Shin Bet, a secret police in a way, or the equivalent perhaps of the MI5, being portrayed in Israel by center-left Israelis as the great defender of democracy. This is the same organization that is part of the occupation apparatus in the West Bank. It's difficult to explain, I think, to an international crowd. And yet, considering everything else that's happening, Bar is a defender of the Israeli democracy. He's a gatekeeper. He's somebody who is perfectly aware of his organizational roles, and he knows the limits of what he can and cannot do. And the danger here is that Netanyahu, who, again, in my view, is one of the main people responsible for October 7th, not only stays in power, but gets to decide who would replace Bar, and may judge this through a lens of loyalty, the same way Trump does. What did Netanyahu say once he came back from visiting Trump last month? There was a long cabinet meeting where he told the ministers that the most important thing was loyalty, that Trump knew the difference, that Trump 2.0, becoming president again in January 2025, learned the lessons from last time, and it's now only about personal loyalty. Nobody would remain from the deep state. This is exactly what he's trying to copy here. This is what he's doing. Now, we don't know who the next guy is. We only know their letters. It's a first letter. We can't even name the names yet. And yet, if he chooses somebody who is a yes man, who is a loyalist, that would have, I think, important implications for the future of Israeli democracy. I'll give you an example I think you remember very well, Yonit. During COVID, Netanyahu was quite a hardliner in the beginning of COVID, quite different, for instance, than Boris Johnson in the UK. And he pushed forward the idea of fusing Shin Bet's capabilities, technological capabilities, of identifying who spoke to who and where, who was at a certain place with other people, in order to limit the public's movement. And the idea, of course, was to prevent the disease from spreading. And yet it was Nadav Argaman at that time, the previous head of Shin Bet, who refused to use some of this equipment because he said, this is not our goal. This was put in our hands in order to stop terrorism, not to regulate the public. And of course, there was a background to this, because this was not only about spreading disease, it was about the possibility that the government would eavesdrop on the protest movement while it was planning demonstrations against Netanyahu. And what's at stake now is, of course, 10 times bigger, because we've been through those years of the judicial overhaul and the war. This is a very different situation than 2020 or 2021.
So I think the picture you've sketched there, and particularly the parallel to Trump, explains the general pattern here, which is in both cases, actually, Trump and Netanyahu, in order to grab more power for themselves, are steadily removing any restraints, checks, balances, guardrails, anything that limits their power. And the head of the Shin Bet is obviously one of those people. So that's the general. But I want to ask you about the particular, which maybe partly explains the timing, but also why he particularly would have wanted to get rid of this man. Qatar. And that is the Qatar gate, the Feldstein affair, so-called. Why don't you, again, perhaps for people outside Israel, explain what the whole business is, but why particularly Bar may have been, a particular thorn in the side of Netanyahu that made it very appealing to him to see the back of him.
Okay, I'll try to do it briefly, and I'll try to avoid this terrible name, Qatargate. I think the Qatari scandal is good enough. Yeah. So he has 3 different media advisors who have been part of his success for quite some time. It's people who operated what Naftali Bennett named the poison machine, this very effective instrument that Netanyahu uses to in a way to gaslight the public and threaten his political enemies and influence the media as well, through mouthpieces in the media, through social media networks and so on. An enormous bot and troll farm working mysteriously behind the scenes. So two of these advisors, it turns out, according to a story in Haaretz published by my colleague Bar Peleg a few months ago, have been accepting money from Qatar for taking part in a campaign to improve Qatar's international image before the World Cup, the Football World Cup Mondial in 2022. The third one, who's Eli Feldstein, the name you mentioned, was already entangled in quite a scandal regarding the Bild and perhaps the Jewish Chronicle story and the misinformation there 6 or 7 months ago. This had to do with the hostages. We won't get into the whole story, but we've discussed it here in the past. Now it's been published by Channel 12 that actually Feldstein was also getting money from Qatar. And since yesterday, there are new developments, because one explanation that Feldstein himself is supplying through his lawyers is, I didn't get money from Qatar. I got it through all kinds of intermediaries because Netanyahu couldn't find a way to pay me. You remember at that time, he had to go through a security check, all kinds of things in his past. Shin Bet would not approve him, so they could not employ him as a worker for the government, the prime minister's office. So Qatar actually, according to Feldstein's lawyers from yesterday, Qatar operated as another Netanyahu family wallet, supplying a way to finance one of his advisors. This is what he's saying. Now, another suspect, Yonatan Urich's lawyers, are saying something completely different. And another person involved, an American lobbyist, is saying, yes, it was me that handled the money, but it was not because of Netanyahu, but because he was actually doing services for Qatar. So there are two explanations there. Either he was getting money from Qatar on Netanyahu's behalf because somebody around Netanyahu asked the Qataris to help finance his work for Netanyahu, which is bad enough. Or the other possibility is that he was accepting money from the Qataris and working for them without any public statement about the possible conflict of interest. And in such cases, there's always the possibility that somebody was actually what we call an agent of influence. Somebody was operating for money with this foreign entity, which is not exactly friendly towards Israel, and in return doing something. We don't know what. This doesn't mean he's a traitor. This doesn't mean he supplied confidential information. And yet there's something very, very shady about the whole affair. How do I know? Because Naftali Bennett, who has kept perfectly quiet about Netanyahu's different adventures in recent years, has suddenly woken up from this very long sleep and attacked Netanyahu and his court yesterday very, very aggressively, hinting that in fact there was treason involved. If Bennett goes all the way, this means that he smells weakness and that he understands that among right-wing voters, this is a problematic issue, because unlike other stuff, corruption doesn't worry the Bibi hardliners so much. But if there's suspicion that actually money that may have used from the same source that may have financed Hamas terror has also somehow mysteriously arrived in Jerusalem, that's a big deal in the eyes of many Israelis, among them, I think, even Likud voters.
I mean, you explained it perfectly. We should add that it was Ronen Bar and the Shin Bet that were investigating this.
Yeah,
and so
sure.
it's considered that it would be very problematic for Netanyahu to now oust. It won't pass this legal threshold because of the reasonableness clause and, of course, the conflict of interest. He can't fire the person who's investigating him.
And in fact, it's both Ronen Bar and Gali Bar Miara who are deeply involved in this investigation.
And Nadav Argaman, the former head of Shin Bet, who said in an interview with me last week, he said, first of all, I don't think anything happened in that office that Netanyahu wasn't aware of, but more than anything, the first person who should have asked for this investigation was Netanyahu himself, because Qatar is involved. It has been a few weeks since Eyal Zamir replaced Herzi Halevi as the chief of staff. What is your assessment of him? Obviously, he needed to kind of distance himself from Halevi, thus saying, for example, that he's going to open up the probes into October 7th, reopen them. But what is your assessment of how independent he will be in regards to this government and the Minister of Defense that appointed him?
Okay, so there are two different aspects here. The first one you've briefly mentioned is the fact that he doesn't carry the burden. He doesn't operate with this metaphorical cross on his back regarding October 7th. He was, in fact, in the past, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army and also the commander of the Southern Command, but that was quite a long time ago. On October 7th, 23, he was Director General of the Ministry of Defense and had no direct connection to the fiasco. And once it was clear that everybody involved should leave office, he was the perfect candidate. And yet he has to distance himself, as you said, a little bit from Halevi, show that this is something else, that he's offering something else in case we have to fight again in Gaza. And it's no surprise and it's no secret that we haven't won in Gaza yet. We haven't destroyed Hamas completely, as Netanyahu has promised to do. So all of this is quite logical. I don't want to be too cynical about this, but you can see media advisors behind almost any movement he's involved in, whether it's taking his picture along the Gaza border, whether it's announcing a surprise drill for the soldiers and so on. That's perfectly normal and it's understandable. The other issue is much more difficult. And I have to say, for the time being, I'm maybe a little bit disappointed with myself, because what I wrote quite a few times, because I've known him for many years and because I've had constant talks with Zamir for quite some time, I said he's not going to be a puppet. He is his own man. He has backbone. He has stamina. He's going back into a job that not everybody would want to do if they were him. He owes nothing to Netanyahu under these circumstances, and he's his own man. And yet, for the time being, I can't say that this assessment is true. What we've seen was the Hagari scandal. I won't get into all of the details right now, but his decision to push out Daniel Hagari was a very efficient spokesperson for the army, perhaps one of the only generals who actually performed well after October 7th. The decision to push him out is quite strange under the circumstances, and there's at least a suspicion that this is political, that Netanyahu and Katz wanted to get rid of somebody who actually performed well and who was always suspected as being perhaps a little bit too nice to hostage families or to the center-left sentiments. So this is one event. Then you have the plans regarding Gaza. Then you have the fact that we're told he has a different opinion than Halevi regarding the control of humanitarian aid in Gaza. And he may not even oppose an Israeli military administration in Gaza if Israel does occupy Gaza again. And we've seen all kinds of statements that got some people on the center-left camp worried. I think it's a bit too soon to tell. But when I made this assessment, and I was quite sure of myself, it turns out to be, if not wrong, then perhaps too early. My judgment was perhaps too early. We'll have to see about that. Mm-hmm. But again, we have to always remember that Netanyahu outsmarts and outmaneuvers anybody from the opposition, whether it's the chiefs of the, not necessarily a political opposition, but also the chiefs of the different security agencies or his political rivals. And when he decides to appoint somebody like Zamir, there's always something happening behind the scenes. You never know what the expectations are or if there are any deals made. I haven't mentioned the draft law yet. But again, what kind of position would he take? Halevi made a U-turn a few months ago, actually saying publicly, once he knew that he was on his way out, he said publicly, we can take any Haredi soldier that is drafted. No matter what number you'll bring us, we'll find use with all of those people, which was the absolute opposite of what the coalition wanted to hear. Would Zamir necessarily stick to the same position? I don't know yet. There was an interesting speech made by, you'll find it strange that I'm saying that, but made by Israel Katz in the government the day they approved his nomination. Katz just read out loud his meetings, what was said during his meeting with Zamir a few weeks back. And what he actually did was sort of committed Zamir to everything he said to Katz eye to eye, which was, of course, the government found as a brilliant thing to do, but it quite limits Zamir's leeway regarding policies in the future.
This may have to be our last question, and maybe it's just a brief one, but we haven't spoken with you on the podcast, Amos, since the military's own internal inquiry into October the 7th emerged. There was a lot of detail in there, and I just wonder, because you are so close to this and you've spent so much time over the last 17, 18 months covering it, was there a new detail, a small thing even, that was new to you, that surprised you, and that has stayed with you in the weeks that have passed since the publication of that inquiry?
I think more than anything else, the investigation supplies context and, if you'd like, colors to what we knew already. The army held extensive briefings regarding the investigations. If I'm not mistaken, I've stopped counting, but I think altogether we spent about 35 hours listening to 10 or 12 different investigations. Some of them are around battles, some of them are around different matters, whether it's the way the military intelligence operated or the Air Force and so on. And it's the combination of all of those details that creates this conclusion and also these emotions that we've discussed quite a lot in the beginning after October 7th. And more than anything else, it's the pure gap between the numbers of people defending places like Kfar Aza or Be'eri or Nir Oz and the people attacking them, the terrorists, Hamas, and then the Gaza mob, and so on. And in some cases, what you see, for instance, Kfar Aza, 14 defenders, all of them first responders, people who are members of the kibbutz, not even real soldiers, reservists, but not enlisted soldiers, fighting against hundreds and hundreds of those terrorists. And this is if you want the explanation in the end, it's pure math or pure physics. You cannot, if you're totally surprised, if this is a strategic surprise, something you haven't been prepared for in any kind of way, and you're woken up at 6:29, and within 15 to 20 minutes, there are people on your doorsteps with AK-47s and with grenades and with RPG rockets and so on. There's no way that you do everything you can to protect yourself. And these guys died like heroes. But that's the reality. We're just outnumbered. It's all about physics. If things have happened a few hours earlier, if there was any kind of warning, if there was a deployment of the forces, then the end result would probably not have been that tragic. And this, more than anything else, forget for a minute about the political debate or the strategic debate or what should be the fate of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is what stays with me more than anything else.
I think you quoted from one of the reports about Nir Oz that the last terrorist left before the first soldier arrived. Which
40 minutes gap, which is...
which kind of tells the story. Amos Harel, we're always so happy to talk to you. The content maybe needs, a little bit of an improvement, but we're very, very
maybe
glad,
next time.
Very glad to talk to you.
Thanks.
Well, our conversations with Amos Harel are always clarifying. This one, I have to say, his very first answer, the way he just, without any ifs or buts, just said, look, this is not some complicated thing about military strategy and corridors and battalions. This is not something where you need a degree in military studies to understand it. This is politics. This is the Prime Minister shoring up his coalition. And as I said at the start of our conversation, that is to me a dispiriting thought, but it has extra authority coming from somebody who knows this and follows it as closely as Amos Harel.
We need to just say, and I try to, every once in a while represent the parts of Israeli society that support the Prime Minister and explain their rationale. I mean, in every poll, you still see the 24, 25 mandates that Netanyahu gets and the Likud gets. I remind you that right after October 7th, it tanked to somewhere around the 18, 19. These people would say to you, and again, there is a very big argument not only on where Israel is going, but how we got here in the first place, how October 7th happened. This is a deep divide. And the people who support Netanyahu will tell you that, first of all, of course, he can fire Ronen Bar because it's, if he doesn't trust the head of Shin Bet, and of course, after what happened on October 7th, that is a legitimate decision. There are people who will tell you, yes, it is a legitimate decision to bring back Ben Gvir, and it's a legitimate decision to go back to the war because obviously Hamas is not defeated. So I'm putting this in parentheses to remind us that there is a large chunk of the Israeli society that think like this. And the other thing to notice, I thought it was really interesting in Amos's conversation, he said the decision about the continuation of the war in Gaza will be made in Washington and not in Jerusalem. And I think that is something to keep in mind because perhaps Netanyahu feels emboldened by Donald Trump, or perhaps he thinks he can, do whatever he wants. But at some point, it is very much a possibility that the American president will say enough is enough, and then you don't have a leverage like Netanyahu had in the Biden administration. We have our awards too. I mean, we've reached that point in our conversation, I think, the awards part.
I think we have. We've got a strong nominee for Chutzpah, but I thought we might, you have something to say on this matter before we dive in.
I told you this. I met a very smart college student this week, American, who listens to our podcast, and he said to me, he's being very polite. I'm going to translate it into Israeli, but he said something like, "Aren't you using the term chutzpah wrong?" And I think we explained this once. You, as our senior expert on linguistics, did explain this at some point. But I think we should re-explain why we're using chutzpah the way we are.
Absolutely happy to do that. One of my favorite topics. But also people can go back to our episode, which I'm sure you know the number of, with Malcolm Gladwell, where we had a whole conversation about this. And he himself had actually done a whole sort of deep dive into the two meanings of the word. And it is used, fascinatingly, for unholy purposes. It has a different meaning in Israel and a different meaning in diaspora, although not really, more in America. So the American usage of the term, I would say, is to mean kind of brio or moxie, sort of pluck in a positive sense, which is somebody who's got, that extra bit of courage which enables them to think out of the box, that they come up with a new idea, that they get themselves from the mailroom to the, top of the company because they've got sort of charismatic courage. That's the American take on chutzpah, which in some ways is very American. The Israeli, and I would say, otherwise Jewish version of chutzpah is kind of, to use an Englishism, brass neck. It's a nerve, temerity, audacity. It means you've got the cheek to ask for something or do something which is really irritating to people around you. The example always given is the man who has killed both his parents and then urges the judge to be lenient with him because he's now an orphan. That is chutzpah. And so chutzpah has that edge that and we go with that definition. So I think your American college student is right about the American Jewish definition of chutzpah, but we're going with a slightly more bitter, old world sort of diaspora, and I would say Israeli version of the word, and that's how we use it. Which brings me to this week's chutzpah nominee, who is America's and therefore probably the world's biggest broadcaster, podcaster Joe Rogan, who hosted on an episode Darryl Cooper. Now, this name may be familiar to listeners because we talked about him a bit when Tucker Carlson had him on. He presents himself as a historian, but is very much in the business of, revising would be a nice way of putting it, the Holocaust. In his interview, Rogan praised Cooper for being nuanced in his views and comprehensive. But what Cooper talked about was that Hitler basically had got a bad rap, and that Hitler's anti-Semitism was born of battle weariness and economic hardship. You've got to feel for the guy. He really opposed what happened in the Kristallnacht pogrom of 1938. And really his anti-Semitism was because he felt Germans were in a, quote, sorry state. They're being manipulated by the Jews, by the Jewish press, by the Jews who are in the theatres, and put out the films or whatever else. I think the thing he said that gave it emotional valence for him, he's talking about anti-Semitism, is that his anti-Semitism is what allowed him to love the German people. And this is part of our whole back catalogue of making excuses for Adolf Hitler. Darryl Cooper is bad enough, but Joe Rogan, to give him this huge platform, to put him on his podcast and really without offering anything in the way of serious criticism, I think is really troubling. It comes after actually another guest that he had on, which is, similarly difficult for Jewish listeners. So I think our Chutzpah award, I'm afraid, goes to rival podcaster Joe Rogan.
And I think I can't disagree with that. It's just all of what you said. I agree with it completely. I think the Mensch award this week, in a way, maybe the Mensch award or the American version of Chutzpah, goes to the founders of Wiz, a company, an Israeli company that was bought for a staggering $32 billion by Google. What Wiz does has to do with cybersecurity infrastructure. The reason they're in the list, not only because, this is obviously the biggest, I think, exit in Israeli high-tech history, and not only because, Israelis will enjoy some of the billions of dollars in taxes, but also because there's a little bit of gumption here, because the first offer from Google was, I think, around the $23 billion, and they said no. And now Google came back with an improved offer of $32 billion, and they said yes. So, that takes some, chutzpah. But
I like it. I think gumption is a very good translation. And I'll add that to my list of synonyms for the American version of chutzpah.
Look at me, the Israeli adding words to Jonathan Friedland's thesaurus. That is
very
chutzpah.
Much. No, my English vocabulary has expanded thanks to you. No, I think that's a very good choice. Those are our awards. I think that's more or less it for this week, barring, of course, yet another update episode.
It really is.
Look,
world. Jonathan and I are used to seeing each other once a week. You forced us to meet each other 3 times a week. We hope that next week is going to be calm, and we'll say our thank yous to Michal Porat, and we will meet next week.
See you then, Yonit.